Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. With this horrible weather we're having, I for one am glad that there's no need to venture out tonight to hear our talk. So make yourself comfortable as we learn about the Great Disruption from guest speaker David McVey. Remember that to pose questions, please log in and type in the chat box in the chat facility that's there. Alternatively, you could take a note of David's email address at the end, and he said that he's happy to field any questions that you might have or that might occur to you after tonight's talk. David is a native of Kirkintilloch and educated at the town's high school before going on to the University of Strathclyde, where it transpires that Professor Tom Devine was one of David's university lecturers. David worked for 14 years at what is now known as the University of West of Scotland. Currently, he is a part-time lecturer in communications and literature at New College, Lanark. David has published around 100 short stories and a huge number of articles, as well as non-fiction titles which focus on history and the outdoors. This is in addition to scripting 2 amateur stage musicals and published poetry and academic journal articles as well. In his spare time, David enjoys hill walking, visiting historic sites, reading, watching TV, and supporting his hometown team, Kirkintilloch Rob Roy FC. If this were a live event, we maybe could burst into a chorus of happy birthday. David has only recently become entitled to his bus pass. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. So I give you tonight's speaker, David McVey. So over to you, David.
Thanks there, Neil. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Neil's already mentioned the weather. I'm in a garden office here. It's got a metal roof. The rain's hammering down, but hopefully you can hear me above the sound of that. What we're going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. I hope, well, of course, I hope you see it. We're actually in plan B when it comes to sharing the screen. So let's hope that it actually does work. Now you should see whatever I'm seeing now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open presentation, and hopefully you should see my first slide elegantly filling your screen just now. Is that okay, folks? Right.
Okay, David, yep.
Grand. Right, we're going to talk about the Great Disruption. Just a wee extra word about myself. What I bring to this, I think, is, as you heard Neil say, I'm a writer, and what fascinates me are stories, and what fascinates me are people. And I quite often, I'm the sort of reader who loves finding footnotes about things. And I find out things and I need to know more and more, so I go and research them. So that's the kind of approach I'm going to take. It won't be a kind of exhaustive step-by-step through the Great Disruption. We'll look at what happened, obviously, but we'll also look at some of the stories. We'll look at some of the people. It's not the talk you would have got if there had been no COVID. Obviously, we'd all been in the same building for one thing, but I'd have been able to get to the National Library, I'd have been able to get to the National Records and other sources. I'm enough of a historian to want to always back up what I say, so what I've done is I've kind of gone back to sources that I know, stuff I've already researched, and what I have been able to establish online. So I hope it's of interest. I hope you learn something new. Hope I make you think. Even if I annoy you, that's something. Okay, so let's just have a wee kind of look at what we're going to cover. I want to, the Great Disruption is the kind of first time we actually see a Presbyterian church in Scotland with the word free in its name. And when you mention the word free and church in the same sentence, you get a lot of responses, you get a lot of kind of prejudices, for want of a better word. So I'm going to have a wee kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek look at what that can mean. I'm going to look at just what happened in the disruption. Want to do some great disruption prehistory, because an awful lot of what burst in 1843 had its roots in the 18th century, or possibly even further back than that. I'm going to look at two people that I'm kind of researched on, the McFarland brothers, if we can call them that. I want to look a wee bit about what happened after the disruption, and in particular I want to look as a kind of prejudice busting thing about the Great Disruption, the Free Kirk, and science and engineering, and also actually slightly art as well. Look at some of the afterquakes of the Great Disruption, because the Great Disruption was preceded by other disruptions, and there were other disruptions to come. And I want a slightly kind of melancholic 20th century footnote as well, just to show that the Great Disruption lives still, if you like. It's astonishing how little the Great Disruption is known, even in Scotland. I don't think it's on many syllabuses at all. And if you go to your laptop and you search for the Great Disruption, you find several books. These are only two of them, called The Great Disruption, but they're not about the one we're talking about. One's about the climate crisis, the other one's a kind of business title. It's written about still in academic papers, but in the popular consciousness, it really isn't there. And maybe one of the reasons we've lost interest in how the Free Church of Scotland came about, maybe this helps to explain it. Now, I'm going to talk about a television programme I don't watch. Maybe you do. It's Call the Midwife. It's very popular. The whole idea doesn't appeal to me, so I've never watched it. However, I was aware of some controversy that was caused by their 2019 Christmas special. Now, it's apparently set in a maternity hospital in the East End of London in the early 1960s. I've no idea how they managed to swing the plot to film or to set their Christmas special in the Western Isles, but they did. And as quite often with television drama, you wonder, oh no, they're going to set it in the Highlands. How many stereotypical Scottish things can they come up with? Well, it's the 1960s, but everybody still lives in thatched houses. Look, sheep. But what else could they come up with? Well, let me show you the words of the production company who actually made it for the BBC. This is what they say. Now, Janet McCaskill, she's a lighthouse keeper's wife, has gone into labour. Dr. Turner, Fred, nurses Dyer and Anderson, regular characters I assume, are dispatched, but the local ferryman refuses to row them over to the lighthouse, citing the commandment forbidding labour on the Sabbath. Now, we all know that however stern and forbidding a Presbyterian you are, you allow errands of necessity and mercy on the Sabbath, and attending to a woman who's about to give birth would definitely be covered by that. Did the BBC know that? I suspect yes, but the plot needed somebody unpleasant, stern, forbidding to do that. So bring in a Presbyterian-looking bloke from Central Casting and say, I'm no doing that on the Sabbath. And there you go. BBC didn't apologise. They just said, well, no offence was intended. And it's purely for dramatic purposes. However, I think it represents a lot of people's misapprehensions, and it certainly falls under stereotyping. So let's go to the Great Disruption itself. You've heard the saying I've put in italics there. It's certainly true. However, what was different about the Great Disruption was that there's an incredible amount of genuine principle there. It was a big disruption. That's why it's called the Great Disruption. It's a major event. And we see this picture here of the Great Disruption painting going on one of its holidays. It's occasionally loaned out by the Free Church to other galleries. And you see that it's taking 4 blokes to handle it. I'm surprised that it doesn't actually have more packaging, but there you go. And it's a big work of art. You could see it as a metaphor for just how big the event itself was. Now, we'll go into this in slightly more detail in a minute, but the key issue behind the Great Disruption was patronage. The insistence that local wealthy patrons could appoint ministers rather than their congregations. It became a hotter topic in the 1830s, partly because this was a time of political reform in the civil arena with the 1832 Reform Bill. Kind of reflecting that, the Church of Scotland's General Assembly passed a Veto Act in 1833, allowing congregations the power of veto over an appointment that a patron made. There were a number of cases of vetoes being attempted, but it was always voted down in the courts, or it was always rejected by the courts. The court said the Church of Scotland had absolutely no legal basis for doing this, because patronage was established in law. And so it became very much more of a cause célèbre even than it had been. By this time, and we'll see how this developed, resistance to patronage was often, not always, but often linked to political radicalism outside the church. The basic facts, we all know what happened. The presiding moderator of the General Assembly in 1843 was Dr. David Welsh. He and 121 ministers and 73 elders left in a very civilized and gracious way and went and formed their own assembly. And on the 23rd of May, a few days later, some sources tell you it was the same day as they left. It wasn't. They signed the wonderfully named Act of Separation and Deed of Demission. It's, as a writer, this kind of appeals to me, to picture this, try to picture this event. Now, it's an event that by all accounts was carried out with great dignity, with great respect, but just think what good television it would make if television was available in those days. They rise, probably most of them are already standing, they leave the church in George Street, and then they go about something less than a mile to this place, which is Tanfield Hall in Cannon Mills, just before where nowadays the Botanical Garden is. Now, if you know Edinburgh, either the 23 or the 27 will take you pretty much door to door on this journey today. They didn't have that. There was nearly 200 of them. There were probably people waiting outside. There were probably people who'd come along just to see what was happening, as always happens, then and now. And just imagine this vast crowd moving down to Tanfield Hall and making this incredible statement. Eventually, obviously not everyone was at the General Assembly. 474 of about 1,200 ministers in the Church of Scotland at that time left and formed the new Free Church of Scotland. First moderator was the Reverend Thomas Chalmers. It's estimated that around 1,500 people were squeezed into Tanfield Hall for the signing of the Act. By no means all of them appear in the painting that we've already seen. There's, I think it's about 400 or 500 people are in that. Not all of whom were there, incidentally, but we'll return to that in a wee bit more detail later. I'm going to show you a wee diagram now, which I really like. This is a kind of diagrammatic flowchart history of the Presbyterian and Reformed churches of Scotland, as if you like, they were a tube map. And you see them splitting, as here, and you see them joining and uniting, as here. There had been a great deal of splits in the 18th century following the Patronage Act, but it all came to a head for our purposes with the disruption, which is in 1843, when the Free Church of Scotland splits from the wider National Church of Scotland. We'll look at the kind of right-hand side, the destinations, if you like, of the tube map later on. But there's a link to it on the number of Wikipedia pages actually to do with Reformed churches in Scotland. So it's a really handy kind of tool. But let's take a step back. Let's think about the 18th century. The Patronage Act was passed in 1711. It took effect in 1712. And the phrase in how it was termed was that local wealthy families could make use of their historic rights to appoint ministers. Church of Scotland wasn't happy about this. Even those that would become known as the moderates initially weren't happy. They came to accept it. The commissioners of the General Assembly apparently were commissioned to make an annual protest to Parliament, and they did every year until 1784, didn't have any effect. As the century emerged, as the century wore on, two kind of groupings emerged in the church. The evangelicals, sometimes known as the Popular Party, who've been the focus of quite a lot of research lately, they bitterly opposed to patronage. The church was God's people. They chose who their pastor would be. The moderates who came to accept it. Now, some in the Popular Party, by no means all, but there is a definite correlation. Many of them became associated with secular political reform. Give you a chance to read this quotation by the Reverend Archibald Bruce, the Whitburn minister, who wasn't actually a Church of Scotland minister at the time. He was in one of the secession churches based in Whitburn. But it's interesting what he says about civil and religious liberty. This is a phrase that we see quite a lot around the time. We see the two being linked. Now, Reverend Archibald Bruce was a radical in politics. The pamphlet that this is taken from is actually, it's a defence of freedom of speech for writers, which I like a lot. I think I find myself warming to the Reverend Archibald Bruce. But he talks about how religious liberty, by which he presumably means the patronage issue mainly, and civil liberty, giving people freedoms, possibly giving them the vote, are kind of basically partners. They're in parallel, but they kind of go together. Incidentally, this the church that he was minister of in the 18th century, it rejoined the Church of Scotland eventually by various circuitous ways, and it's still going, and this is its modern building in Whitburn. Now we come to a fellow called Thomas Muir, whom I'm sure you'll have heard of, the famous political radical, organiser of the Scottish Friends of the People, personal hero of mine. What's less often known is that, as well as being a political radical, he was a conservative, if you like, member of the Popular Party, if you like, evangelical Christian. He was an elder of Cadder Parish Church in Bishopbriggs. This is the present building. Again, it's not the building that he would have known, but he was an elder. Some people struggle with this idea. I think it's like I say about said before about prejudice, about stereotyping. How can someone who is a political radical be an evangelical, be a fundamentalist or whatever? And Hector Macmillan, best known as a poet, wrote a really good book about Thomas Muir in 2005. And in that he said it may be that the progressive young man in politics was reactionary in his faith, and you can sense the disapproval there. But it was not an unusual thing. There is a correlation, as I say. And in fact, Thomas Muir got caught up in the whole patronage issue. He and his congregation wanted to appoint a Reverend Proven to the Church of Cadder in Bishopbriggs. But James Dunlop of Gunkirk, an industrialist, local grandee, he had the right of patronage, and he wanted to appoint the chaplain to a local landed family. interesting thing about that, I mean, to me, it makes it sound like something out of Jane Austen. You know, someone grants a living to someone in some kind of leafy corner of Berkshire. This was fought. It went all the way to the Court of Session. And this is part of one of the papers that were actually found recently in the archives of Glasgow Uni, or just in relatively recent years. These have actually been come to light. Unfortunately, it's sometimes been reported that they actually managed to get the Reverend Provan in. Apparently, they didn't, and the courts, as they did even after the Veto Act, they overturned it. And they found in favour of the grandee. This is a wee advert. If you want to know more about Thomas Muir, Thomas Muir, Hunter's Hill, Essays for the 21st Century. There's a lot in there about the 18th century background, about the Popular Party, about the moderates. I've also got an essay in that about someone who was a friend of Muir, who was also a friend of Sir Walter Scott. Now, I'm a big fan of Sir Walter Scott. I'm one of the diminishing band of people who actually read his work. He, of course, was a political reactionary. If you go to Abbotsford, there's a really good video where a number of people tell us what Sir Walter Scott means to them. Kirsty Wark is a bit like Hector Macmillan. She just doesn't get this correlation. She says, another great thing about Sir Walter Scott was that he was a moderate in religion, which is actually pretty much the same as saying that he was a reactionary in politics, which by most standards he was. But Muir and Scott, very different people, were also a friend of a chap called John McFarland of Ballinclare. Now, I've got my chapter in the book about Thomas Muir is actually about John McFarland. He was known as the Liberal Laird. Ballinclare is the name of his house. It later became a hotel. It's now a Roman Catholic retreat site. But I first became aware of him decades and decades ago because there's a fascinating burial ground near the old kirk at the Clachan of Campsie, near where I live. And his epitaph is very difficult to read now. Fortunately, I took it down back then. And this is the first half of what it says. And look, there's this phrase again, civil and religious liberty. Now, we know he was a liberal. He anticipated the Scottish Access Concordat by hundreds of years by actually opening his land to people who wanted to go out for a walk or to have a picnic or whatever. He gave free legal advice to local people. He campaigned for reform. And this is the rest of his epitaph, which is wonderful epitaph, actually. But this was something that always struck me. He tried to do good by his writings, and I wondered what those writings actually were. Eventually, I managed to get to the National Library of Scotland. We've got a copy of most of his writings. These are the things that he wrote much later in his life, generally when he was retired from the bar. And most of I'm going to show you a few quotes from what he's written, mostly from this book, or it's really a pamphlet, and it's a electioneering pamphlet. And there was an election coming up, and a neighbouring grandee, Sir Archibald Edmonston of Duntreath, had written 6 letters to the electors. John McFarland managed to get by with just 1, although it's about 30 pages or so. Sir Archibald Edmonston was kind of old school. He was not a reformer. He wasn't anything in the Church of Scotland. He was an Episcopalian. An impressive figure in many ways, a traveller. He knew the Middle East well and wrote a book about it. He wrote books of Episcopalian devotion. But some of his views would strike us as being a little bit old-fashioned. He didn't believe in education for the working classes, and he definitely didn't believe in education of native peoples, if we can call them that, who converted to Christianity as a result of mission work. And the reason why he didn't like these people being educated well, there was two reasons. Educating them gave them ideas, and educating them made them think. Now, John McFarland was very much in favour of education for the working classes, for people in mission stations, for exactly the same reasons. He was in favour of educating the working classes because it gave them ideas and because it made them think, and that these were good things. And this is the kind of thing in these radical evangelicals of the time that kind of flow into another theme that we'll see coming out of the Great Disruption, which is that of education. The Free Kirk was in a position where they had to educate a lot of ministers quickly because they were short of them. So they built theological colleges, but they were generally very much active in education as a whole. But what I'd like to do now, and I'm not doing this to. These are excerpts from a kind of election campaign where John McFarland favoured the Radical candidate, and he was having pot shots at the Tories. So I'm not having a go at anyone who happens to be a Conservative, but just remember how many maybe modern commentators would be confused by this, because here's John McFarland, a Calvinist, evangelical, fundamentalist member of the Popular Party. But here's what he says politically. I'll read the last one out because it just deserves to be read out. But just have a look at these. Okay, hopefully you've got a taste of John McFarland's style now. I wish he'd written more and had written more than pamphlets. Here's another one. And the last one I absolutely love, because if, for example, you were an election agent for someone in the SNP or Labour or Liberals, you could probably use this. It's really up to date and modern sounding and brilliant one-liner. Are you willing to bear a helping hand in the destruction of your own rights, your own liberty, your own laws? Then choose a Tory for your member. And there's John McFarland, the Calvinist evangelical churchman. He shows all the signs of being the kind of person who joins with those leaving the Church of Scotland at the Great Disruption. But he doesn't. He talks a little bit about why in some of his later pamphlets. The reason really, I think, was just loyalty. He stuck with the church that he was in, just as many evangelicals did. Most evangelicals left, but not all of them. However, John McFarland's brother did leave. Patrick McFarland was the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1833. Incidentally, did you know, 2 years later, he was succeeded by William Eyre Thompson, who was originally from Markinch. He was a minister of a church in Perth, and he left the Church of Scotland at the disruption and formed and built a new Free Kirk in Perth, but he was originally from Markinch. After the disruption, Patrick McFarland actually became moderator of the General Assembly of the Free Church. So he was moderator of two different churches, and that's not something that you get often. Interesting thing about him was that he was involved in discussions that formed the Evangelical Alliance, which is still going today, UK-wide in 1846. Now, Patrick McFarland, interestingly, definitely an evangelical, not a political radical. There's a couple of themes about a time when he was at a church in Greenock and he clashed with people who were political radicals. Now, I wanted to follow that up. I couldn't. I actually tried to book to get into the National Library of Scotland in November or December, and it was fully booked. Imagine libraries being fully booked, but that was under the COVID regime. However, before we leave the Reverend Patrick McFarland, he's significant in a way for one particular reason. He's in the painting, and he's the man we see actually signing the Act of Separation and Deed of Demission. We don't actually have a picture of John McFarland, but yep, we've got a picture of his brother. Okay, we've done a bit of prehistory. We've seen the kind of bare bones of what happened at the disruption. What were the effects? What happened afterwards? I'll let you read through these. One of them you would think is a kind of dispassionate comment on the disruption. It's from one of my old lecturer Tom Devine's books. The other one's from Free Kirk Minister recently, the Reverend David Robertson. Just have a look at those. I'm not going to focus much on the missionary work that resulted from the Great Disruption, but it did happen. And again, to their credit, the Free Kirk missionaries, they were not really related to commerce. They really weren't related to empire building. They really did focus on sharing their faith and in building Christian communities where they were. But the kind of philanthropic mission of the Free Kirk, if you like, came to the fore quite quickly. Incidentally, I just put this in today. One or two people were asking questions in advance about, what happened to the Church of Scotland after the disruption? And, I'm not actually that sure, because people tend to focus on the Free Kirk. I did look for a paper, and this one did appear in volume 48 of Scottish Church History in 2019. I'd love to have read it and be able to tell you what was in it. But unfortunately, it's one of those papers you have to actually be in the National Library to actually access it. But it's on my list, and we can all queue outside the National Library once it's open again to read it. Now, the Highland potato famine over 1846, 1847, it was a kind of echo of the Irish potato famine that happened earlier. It wasn't as serious, but there was hunger, there was suffering. It was a very serious issue. It had this in common with the Irish potato famine, that the government's response was pretty awful. And it's generally, and I've checked a number of sources for this, everyone agrees that the Free Church's mission, where it actually tried to ease things, give people food, rehouse people, give people work sometimes, was a very impressive piece of philanthropy. And the word that quite often crops up is, in this wee quotation that I've given you from Geraldine Vaughan here, efficient. It's not an exciting word, but if you're distributing food to people who are hungry, efficiency is a good thing. And again, something that the sources agree on is that there was nothing sectarian about this. The aid, the relief was given to everyone that they came across who needed it, whether they were Free Kirk, whether they were Church of Scotland, whether they were Roman Catholic, or even in the extremely unlikely circumstance that they might be Episcopalian, or if they were nothing. And it's one of the kind of great credit things, I suppose, to the early Free Kirk, that all the sources pretty much agree in that. A few other things that kind of flow from the disruption, the incredible scale of church building that had to happen. I mean, the famous case of the floating kirk in Strontaine, where the congregation weren't allowed to organise on land, so they took to they actually got a boat and had their church there. I mean, one of the issues that the Church of Scotland would have faced, of course, was shortage of ministers, because 474 left. However, the Free Kirk faced some of the same problems, because it wasn't an even split. It's estimated that about 80% of the congregations, or 80% of the manpower, if you like, of the Free Kirk in the Highlands left the established church, but only 20% of the ministers did. So there were flourishing churches, but they had to share ministers, or elders had to preach, and there was this overriding need to train ministers. The new college, now part of Edinburgh University's Divinity faculty, was begun in 1846. The foundation stone was laid. It was laid, of course, by the Reverend Thomas Chalmers. Another thing which talked about is this. Presbyterians, I hope I may be allowed to say this, Presbyterians have an incredible record for coming up with great ideas and giving them horrible names. And so we have sustentation. I think I've got that right. It's very simply, they tried to get their new churches to give something like a penny a week to raise funds so that they could pay ministers. And this grew and this grew, and it became a sort of accepted way for independent churches, or churches independent of the state, to actually pay their ministers. You see, this is a post office directory from Greenock from 1873, and you see there's two Free Kirks mentioned here, and one of them has a William McNeill, who's the convener of the Sustentation Fund, and St Andrew's Free Church it actually has a treasurer to the Sustentation Fund. So it was obviously, they appointed one of their church officers, one of their elders, to actually focus particularly on this. There's possibly quite a lot of research to be done about this. So somebody did ask in advance about, what records are there. Well, I can tell you that the National Library of Scotland has the Free Church of Scotland's bank books relating to this fund throughout the 19th century. Now, I don't know what condition they're in. I imagine they're sort of huge, great ledgers. They're not kind of wee sort of modern Royal Bank of Scotland things. But if anyone wants to research that, they are there in the manuscripts department. Let's look at something that you might not instantly think of in terms of the Free Church. This is the disruption brooch. It's held by, it's in Fife. It's in the St Andrews University Museum. I'm not sure who it was made for. It's certainly it's probably a kind of feminine thing. It has slightly unusual ornament, and if you look in the middle here, various heroes of the Presbyterian faith are commemorated by having their gravestones in the middle. Lots of other decorations. You can see thistles and everything, but there are also the dates of various important events in Presbyterian Scottish history. 1638 there, the National Covenant. And of course here, we have 1843, the Great Disruption. It's believed to have been made in 1843 or shortly afterwards. Again, you don't think in particular terms of art and the Free Church, but remember, this Free Church, once everyone had left, it was half the size of the remnant National Church. It was wider, it was more diverse, if I can use that word, than the Free Church would be today. I mean, that's not meant as a criticism. It's just a smaller church today, whereas this was a large nationwide organisation. So that's the disruption brooch. That's one example of the kind of art that flowed out of the disruption. But then there's this one. Now, we've already considered this. David Octavius Hill, who was a respected painter, was commissioned to do a record of the signing of the Act of Separation, Deed of Dimission, etc., etc. And he did so. It took him somewhere in the region of 23 years. It wasn't finished until 1866. Many of the people represented in it had died by then. But he'd planned for that. He was one of the pioneers of photography in Scotland, along with his assistant Robert Adamson, who's a Fifer. He was from St Andrews, who went to Mar College. And they photographed many of the people they wanted to include. in the painting. And it's believed this is the first example of a painting based on photography. Remember, this is 1843. Photography is really just emerging from the shadows. Calotypes were the kind of, or was the method of photography that they used at the time. A lot of, not all, but a lot of the portraits survive, and some of the pictures that I'm showing you of people are there. David Octavius Hill, Robert Adamson photographs where they sat to be included in the disruption painting. Many of them are actually in the possession of the University of Glasgow, and I believe under normal circumstances you can have access to them. They're some of the earliest examples of photographic portraits. I've never been able to find him, but Hill is in the painting. He apparently has his photographic equipment with him. It's got to surely be the first painting to include photographic equipment, I would have thought. And there are many, many well-known figures in it. However, a few things to point out. A number of them, and they're based on real people, are crofters or farmers, fishermen, lobstermen, ordinary people who were elders in this new free kirk. There are women. A number of women are included because women were at the original Tanfield Hall assembly. No one would begin to suggest that there's even a glimmer of the nascent Free Kirk of Scotland being some kind of feminist organisation, but I think it's significant and it's a beginning that women are there, and if they have a contribution, it's being recognised. A few, even from distance, people that you'll recognise. There's Hugh Miller, and up here is the Reverend Thomas Chalmers. I'm not sure I'd call it great art. It's really a historical document. It's really a celebration within the Free Kirk of what they mean, what they're about, why they began, what this initial Free Kirk assembly was about. So if it's not great art, it's impressive in so many other ways, not least as we've already seen in its size. There's Robert Adamson and David Octavius Hill. What I'm thinking about just now is sometimes the narrative of religion in the 19th century, it's all about how it has to be driven out and how science must drive religion out. And once religion is sidelined, we can actually get on with serious science. Now, that may be the case in the Church of England. It's certainly not the case in the Free Kirk, because here we have two real pioneers of photography. I've seen several photographs of Octavius Hill, and there's always something incredibly modern about him. He's got kind of a lockdown haircut for a start. Adamson had been a student of Sir David Brewster when he was at St Andrews. Sir David Brewster wrote about photography, and that's what got Robert Adamson keen on this new science and practice. And there's what Robert Crawford has written about Sir David Brewster. Now, Brewster was basically a physicist. His specialist field was optics. And what that's often reduced to now is, we all know he invented the kaleidoscope. But what he was also responsible for was the science behind it. And he is a hugely respected scientist, even today. I'd strongly recommend, if you haven't read it, Robert Crawford's book, which looks at St Andrews in the early 1840s, and how Brewster and Adamson and Hill kind of working together, taking their photographs in their daily round. They basically made St Andrews one of the first towns in the world to be fairly comprehensively photographed, or to have their people comprehensively photographed. And this is all within the Free Kirk. These people are all in the painting. Now, possibly the most celebrated person who's in the painting, the most celebrated figure within the Free Kirk, is Thomas Chalmers. Now, I won't give my own assessment of him. Here's a couple of assessments. John Roxburgh is a New Zealand ecclesiastical historian. Michael Fry, you'll have heard of, he's a journalist and secular historian. This is from his book about the history of Glasgow. It does kind of astonish me that I look back on my school education particularly, and I know a lot of people didn't, but I got quite a lot of Scottish history. I don't remember Thomas Chalmers ever being mentioned. And really, if there's someone who should be, it's surely him. This, it's a memorial window for Chalmers, which you can now see in the St Andrews University Museum. It's interesting that, as I said, this Free Church of Scotland was a bit more diverse, a bit wider, had more streams in it than maybe it does today. Because basically, what are these but graven images? What are Hills and Adamson's photographs but graven images? Likewise, the painting. Of course, another very famous person who's in the painting is Hugh Miller, a kind of self-made man, self-educated, great scientist. Tragically, he struggled with what we'd nowadays recognise as his mental health, and he took his own life. But quite an amazing and inspirational figure in many ways. Another one, of course, Sir James Young Simpson, the first person to convincingly and safely demonstrate an anaesthesia used in medicine. He was much wider than, that's what he's always known as. That's the kind of catchphrase. Oh yeah, Simpson anaesthesia. But apparently, I didn't know this until recently. He was quite one of the earliest advocates of actually employing midwives in maternity situations. So you could say he's one of the great grandfathers of Call the Midwife. And how does the BBC thank him? By making fun of his church. But again, religion versus science, I'm not particularly seeing it within the Free Church of Scotland in its early days. Some of you may recognise this. This is Barstow Brick Hill, and I'm pretty sure it's quite near Kirkcudbright. You can see it from Threave Castle. I didn't know what this monument was, so I did what any person would do when I was there. I went and climbed it. And there's this inscription on top, Nielsen Hot Blast 1828. And it commemorates James Beaumont Nielsen, who I'm delighted to say is a Glaswegian, from Shettleston, who discovered that hot blast rather than cold blast greatly improved the efficiency of blast furnaces in iron founding. He managed Glasgow's gasworks at the time. And this was apparently an incredible advance that made industry much, much more efficient. He became quite rich. He bought the Queen's Hall estate just below Barstow Brick Hill, and that's why his monument is there. He was an evangelical. He came out at the Great Disruption, and he's in the Great Disruption painting. It's quite a gallery, if you like, of scientific engineering achievement. Let's move on and let's go back onto the underground, if I can put it that way. There's the disruption. There's the Free Church of Scotland. A couple of the 18th century secession churches join it after it's formed. But then there are disputes, there are disagreements. Some people, some of the sterner people worry that the doctrinal purity of the church is going. And so some of them decamp as early as 1893, scenting the way the wind is going perhaps, and they form the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. So there's a wee disruption there. And then, true enough, in 1900, the Free Church joins with the United Presbyterian Church to form the United Free Church, except, I hope you're keeping up, some stay behind, and the Free Church as we really know it today, a much smaller but still very active and vibrant group, continues. Gets more complicated still. This United Free Church eventually merges with the National Church. There had been, even before the merger with the United Presbyterian Church, there had been a drift back to the National Church. Patronage was ended in 1874, so that barrier wasn't there anymore. But even here, as you see, the United Free Church, some people don't join, and they continued, and they still exist today. In this kind of fragmented mosaic of Presbyterian churches in Scotland. United Free Church, incidentally, from 1930 they admitted women ministers, and in 1960 they had the first female moderator of their General Assembly. But I want to move a wee bit further along the timeline now of the Free Presbyterian Church, because we're seeing churches joining, but there are still disruptions. There are still people, there are still effectively splits because some people are staying behind. So it's what you might call afterquakes of the Great Disruption. I want to focus on this man. Now, we saw the Free Presbyterian Church splitting away from the Free Church in 1893. Like the Free Church, they were very active in the mission field. The place they focused on was what's now Zimbabwe. And to their very great credit, from a very early stage, the Zimbabwean people who came along to church, who joined their church, were seen as equals. They were trained and qualified for the ministry. They served as ministers. What's slightly different from some missionary situations is that the Free Presbyterians didn't set up a Free Presbyterian Church of Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it would have been then. They set up Free Presbyterian Churches of Scotland. And Zimbabwe, these churches in Zimbabwe were the Presbytery of Zimbabwe. Just like any other presbytery of the Free Presbyterian Church, like the ones that are in Scotland, there are other churches around the world as well who are gathered in another presbytery. And obviously, the Zimbabwean ministers were ministers of the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And in 1988, the Reverend Ned Bailey, he was the moderator of the Synod of the Free Presbyterian Church. They have a synod, not a General Assembly. And I don't want to make too much of this because even then, the Free Presbyterian Church was a very small organisation. But we still haven't had a black leader of a political party. We still haven't had a black editor of a major newspaper. It's 4 years away from Bill Morris being leader of the Transport and General Workers Union. And here's national, international organisation, and their most prominent figure is from the black and ethnic minority community, which I think is incredible. It's not much known about, perhaps because the Reverend Ned Bailey's legacy is slightly tainted by the affair involving this man, Lord McKay of Clashfern, who was the Lord Advocate in the Conservative government. He was a Free Presbyterian, an elder. He attended a couple of colleagues' funerals. They happened to be Roman Catholics, and this was deemed unacceptable, and he was ejected by his presbytery. It came to the Synod in 1989, and because the new moderator of the Synod was from the same presbytery that had made the complaint, the Reverend Ned Bailey had to take the chair in what was effectively a court, and of course Lord McKay was ejected from the church. It's a spectacular PR disaster for the Free Presbyterian Church. I don't know if they see it in those terms. Lord McKay was a Conservative, but he was widely respected across political parties, across religious denominations, in the wider community, still is. And so we have another minor afterquake. Some people don't think this is acceptable, so they leave and they form the associated Presbyterian churches. And so we have another mini disruption, if you like. Doesn't stop there. As you probably know, that the Free Church of Scotland had a minor kind of disagreement in the year 2000, and so we now have the Free Church of Scotland and the Free Church continuing. Aftershocks that kind of reflect the arguments, or perhaps the echoes of the arguments that go way back to 1843. And I'll finish where we started. We'll go back to this incredible painting. And just a few wee thoughts of conclusion. I think, yes, it's quite acceptable to say that this event changed Scotland. It certainly changed the church in Scotland, but it was part of a pattern. There were similar disruptions before, there were similar disruptions after, but not perhaps as great as this one, as far-reaching in its effects. Whenever we see a program, I feel as if I'm really going for the BBC in this, but whenever we see a program about the church in the 19th century, it's usually something that's happened down south, about the Oxford movement, or about the Wilberforce debate after the origin of species, or about the Sea of Faith, Dover Beach and all that. And I think this is so much better. It's so much more interesting. It's so much more human. Like we talked about this group of people in Tanfield Hall in 1843. Some of them are ordinary working men. Some of them are women. These movements that always get talked about a lot in historical programmes on the BBC in the 19th century England are generally upper class. They're all men. None of them have ever been fishermen or farmers or whatever. And there's a real sense of, whether you agree with it or not, principle behind the Great Disruption. And I think when we study the people involved, we see so much in what's usually lazily said about the Free Church or the Free Churches in Scotland is absolutely blown away, because we're looking at a building that contains an incredible amount of scientific genius, artistic genius, innovation, hard-working ordinary people, and men and women. So I hope that's made you think. I hope it's given you sort of maybe some new things, maybe looked at some old things in a new way. It's not massively easy in this context to ask questions, but I'm quite happy, as long as you're kind, to take any questions you have. That's my college address. And thanks for having me. Now I'm going to end this. Thank you.
That's us back, David. Well, thank you very much. And let people, maybe come up with some questions just in the next few minutes. There's one already, but first of all, I just wanted to thank you for such an interesting talk. I knew sort of the bare bones, I suppose, about it, but probably didn't appreciate just the intricacies and the almost the sort of entangled web of splits and further splits, and just I certainly didn't know much about the characters, if anybody, involved. The 1843, that was pretty much all I knew, but you went into, you gave us the detail of it, and you delivered it in an expert way, and I'm sure everybody has got a far greater appreciation and understanding of just what took place. So yes, thank you very much for that. And I don't know if you could see that question there, David, from Bruce. Was the revolutionary spirit that swept Europe around 1848 blunted in Scotland, where energies were instead channeled into church disputes about patronage?
Well, I mean, I think that especially in terms of the free church, the issue about patronage had been kind of dealt with in the split itself. It's an interesting question. I mean, Scotland, there were people in Scotland who were involved in the Chartist movement, the Anti-Cornwall League, and things like this round about then. So there were kind of revolutionary spirits around. There's an argument for saying that the disruption itself was, if you like, quite a revolutionary thing. Certainly in Scotland, it felt quite revolutionary. So things really did change.
Okay, and the question from Lorna. Now, Lorna says that she studied the disruption in the late 1990s, and I've learned a whole lot more. Thank you. I think Robert Chalmers was a fifer from Anstruther and now has his street.
Well, I tried to find as many fifers as you can see.
So yeah, there seem to be quite a few. I suppose that in some respects it's perhaps not surprising given St Andrew's place in all this and its place in ecclesiastical history as well, of course. So it's maybe not much of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that surprised me was how few ministers from the Highlands made the jump, but how few ministers from the Lowlands did, because it kind of reverses our kind of traditional picture of the Free Church, but then it's what I say about the kind of mismatch that it must have been really difficult for the Church of Scotland to match churches to ministers after the disruption, but it wasn't easy for the Free Church either, just through geography.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, have you had any feel for why that there was that difference between the Highlands and the Lowlands or the Central Belt?
I don't particularly. If I was speculating irresponsibly, I would maybe I don't know, maybe a lot of Highland congregations were fed up with the ministers. I don't know. Maybe they were too close to the landowners. Remember, this is the time of the clearances and so on. I don't know. That's me just being exactly what I shouldn't be in front of all these learned historians.
One thing that you, there's Lorna with another question. Good. She says, I think the local schoolmaster in Markinch was very much involved. That does kind of ring a little bell. Anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, you've already mentioned that your minister went. So, I mean, I think there is possibly, for some of you, an article for Scottish Local History Journal forming Markinch and the Great Disruption. Don't let me stop you.
One thing that you have touched on this, and that was to do with the Veto Act being passed to try sort of avoid the crisis. And understand that if the majority of head of household members voted against the Lair's choice of minister, it would be vetoed. But how often was that used, and especially in terms of, you know, were congregations brave enough themselves to make that kind of challenge?
It did happen. I mean, there were a number of cases, but remember, it was the church itself that passed the Veto Act. It was an act of the General Assembly, and if enough people did vote it down, yeah, they could veto it. But the legal system said the church had no authority in this, because remember, patronage was laid down in parliamentary law. It wasn't church law. It was actually in law, and so that kind of fueled the anger, if you like. So there were a number of cases that were all thrown back by the courts. And even Robert Peel, policeman man, he apparently waded in and said, look, you have no authority in this. You can't turn people down. Patronage is the law. So you could say that maybe Robert Peel had a hand in the Great Disruption as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So almost a kind of conflict between church law, as it were, and the law of the land. Yeah. I
mean, it was basically, if you like, it's almost the Twa Kingdoms thing going way back into Scottish history. I see Lorna's asking, which one of the free churches is now known as the Wee Frees. I mean, I think that's kind of tangled. I was always told that it was the Free Presbyterian Church because it's much smaller than the Free Church of Scotland. But I've also seen it stated that it dates way back from after the 1900 Union, and the Free Church of Scotland was the kind of rump or the remnant of that, and they were known as the Wee Free. I don't know. It's become corrupted, and it's used kind of fairly, no pun intended, freely.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about which branch resulted in the Wee Frees. I suppose you tend to just associate that more with the islands and Highland region.
I mean, one thing, this is very flippant, and I apologise before I even say it, but I've known people who've been in all of these churches, and the thing that struck me about people who are in the Free Church of Scotland was that they told jokes about Free Presbyterians. Would you believe? I mean, it's another, I suppose, stereotype buster, because they do tell jokes.
I think quite early on in the talk that you mentioned that things were kind of starting to maybe people were maybe feeling a wee bit disenfranchised, and things were kind of starting to rumble. So, because it seems that certainly in terms of Markinge, that Markinge seemed to be ready for the event, for the disruption, because in the March of 1843, meetings had been held, and there was two local ladies. They'd offered to fund both a church and a manse. And of course, that led on to what you were talking about there, was the sustentation fund. I mean, was that quite common that it was kind of almost expected that this was going to happen?
Things definitely accelerated after the Reform Act, after the Veto Act, and the signs that it was completely useless, and the fact that there was just no movement from the government, and there was a lot of organisation. I mean, you sometimes, I think, and some of the more rosy spectacled accounts of the disruption suggest that it was almost kind of on the spot, let's go. But it was planned. It was very much planned, certainly at a local level, as you say, but there were also discussions between those who were attending and who were in favour of walking out before the actual assembly itself. I think we sometimes look down on our forebears because they didn't have Twitter or other social media to kind of organise beforehand, but they had their ways. It involved meeting face to face generally, but they could organise and they could plan, and we see the result.
And do you feel that was months beforehand, or even a couple of years, perhaps?
Oh, I think it was definitely in the wind. The exact form it took, maybe not, but it was definitely something was definitely going to happen. I think I don't think you do what those people did, given the meaning it had at the time, on a whim. No,
I mean to offer to fund a church and a manse, obviously was a big commitment, and something that you wouldn't do lightly. So it must have been very much in the air.
I mean, apparently, just from sort of members and supporters, in the first 4 years after the disruption, the Free Church raised something like £1.5 million for church building, which it probably wouldn't build you a pulpit now, but back in those days, that was an incredible sum of money. A lot of it given by sort of members who would just be very ordinary people, who didn't have much.
And was that directly from the Sustentation Fund, or?
The Sustentation Fund was part of that, but there was also general donations. People, their wealthier supporters would give money as well. Quite separate from just the fund, because strictly speaking, the Sustentation is the penny a week.
And I wondered about that, David, whether that the penny a week, or indeed maybe the bigger donations, although they're maybe more likely, the record still exists of the penny per week per member. Yes, the records.
You would probably be looking at local archives for that, because it would be sort of in they would be local parish kirks, wherever their records are kept. As I said, the actual National Free Kirk bank books, probably ledgers showing their sustentation funds, incomings, outgoings, etc., are held in the National Library. Now, I haven't seen them because I wasn't able to go and see them, but they are there. So if anyone's, I got the impression beforehand that a couple of people were interested in following this up, but they are there, and they're easily found on the National Library website, so you can put yourself in the queue for seeing them.
Yeah, I suppose it's a question of, because they'll be physical physical records. I take it that you have to go in.
They are, yeah. I mean, the National Library is great, and a lot of stuff is available digitally or online. The particularly journal articles, you generally have to go there even to see them electronically, but they are gradually sort of digitizing a lot of stuff. Whether they'll digitize the Free Kirk of Scotland's sustenation bank books, I don't know, but they're not going to bin them, so they're going to be there. Yeah.
So as you say, anybody that's interested in having a look at that, well, certainly for a local level, if nothing else, it definitely would be of interest, as to, because you would probably recognise family names and so on. So yeah,
sure. But I would also check what local archives have about them, see what church records are surviving. Unfortunately, a lot of these things get destroyed, but a lot of them do get discovered. I mean, somebody in the village might move, and then when people are doing up their house, they find this stuff in the attic. I mean, it happens all the time, so you never know.
Indeed. There's another question from Lorna. Do you see that, David?
Yes, I tried to say that education in general got a real boost from it, and there were a number of sort of schools at different levels. They even set up ragged schools in some of the cities, which I suppose we don't really associate the cities with the Free Kirk, but they did do this sort of for poor children, and I mean, I think that this is something that possibly needs a wee bit more research, but there was a great kind of desire for education, which flows back to the old thing about, we need to make sure everybody can read their Bible kind of thing. I see Bruce is coming back there, and he's making a very good point about sort of local newspaper reports, and I think that's good advice as well. If you're looking for local input to the Great Disruption, well, let's see what the local newspapers, if there are any at the time, are saying.
Okay. So perhaps we've exhausted all the questions at the moment, but if you do have any questions for David, he's happy to answer them by email. If you didn't happen to catch his email address, you could always email us, whether the Facebook page or through the website, and I'll pass it on to David. That's something that we could definitely do. So if there's no more questions, I'll just end the broadcast after thanking David again. And David, if you could just hang on in the studio.
Sure thing.
I'll just end the broadcast. But once again, thanks very much for your time and for the effort that you've put into providing so much detail on a subject that I don't think it has been discussed very much. So that's that's a good thing, because it's not one of the sort of normal topics that you tend to hear about. So I'm sure everybody's gained a lot of knowledge tonight. So I'm just going to end the broadcast there, and thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next month. And if I've got the title right, it's going to be How to Make an Omelette. But of course, it's not about how to make an omelette as such. but details of that will wing their way to you shortly. Good night, everyone.
Good night.